o som. Olá, bom dia, não, boa tarde, né? Apesar de ser quase bom dia. Me chamo Leandro, sou jornalista de audiovisual aqui do SESC Rio. E em nome do SESC queria dar as boas-vindas a todo mundo que veio prestigiar a Masterclass do James Benning. A gente aqui no SESC tem o prazer imenso de realizar essa Masterclass, especificamente no SESC Copacabana, em diálogo com essa programação incrível do Festival ECRÃ, que está acontecendo desde o dia 1º, encerra presencialmente agora no dia 10, amanhã. Espero que vocês estejam bem, espero que vocês tenham pego ali os fones, não sei se eu estou enxergando todo mundo aí com esses equipamentos para a gente ter uma tradução simultânea aqui, né? O Breno vai ministrar a Masterclass em inglês. Bom, só queria, antes de dar a palavra aqui para os meninos e para o James, dizer que essa é uma programação que faz parte também de um conjunto de programações de cinema, de audiovisual aqui do SESC Rio. Hoje vocês devem ter percebido que a gente está num cenário um pouquinho incomum, que o Teatro de Arena, a gente está recebendo um espetáculo ao longo desse mês, chamado Balcão, do Renato Carrera. Boa tarde para todo mundo, espero que vocês tenham um ótimo momento aqui.
Boa tarde, gente. Em realizando esse sonho, esse desejo, só queria fazer agradecimentos, primeiro para o Pedro e a Rio Lopes, a gentileza dele, o trabalho, e principalmente para o Leandro, que acho que não seria possível se não fosse pelo esforço dele para trazer audiência para cá. Desejo nosso desde a segunda edição. Muito obrigado.
Tentar não falar muito, porque senão me enrolo. Quero também agradecer a presença de todo mundo, agradecer não só ao Leandro, mas a toda a equipe do SESC, né, que nos dá apoio de verdade, né, em outros anos também, e esse ano para trazer o James Benning aqui pela primeira vez no Brasil. Eu tenho só duas coisinhas para falar, que é o seguinte: na primeira edição que a gente teve James, né, na segunda e desde lá a gente teve ele, né, filmes dele todos os anos, inclusive nas versões online. Ele fez um pedido, que era o nosso de primavera e o nosso de outono. E ele falou, coloca um dia, né, 24 horas de diferença entre um filme e outro. É um detalhe, mas que me chamou a atenção já, olha só. Um detalhe que às vezes ninguém percebeu, mas está ali, né, na programação, no pedido dele, no pensamento dele também. E o outro é uma alegria estar nesse espaço aqui, pisar nesse palco, assim. Eu já fui ator aí na minha adolescência há um tempo, então é interessante estar pisando em outros palcos, de outras formas. E acho que é mais isso, né? Deixar a palavra para quem veio aqui falar mais do que eu. E a gente vai ter também depois, né, tanto a fala do James Benning, quanto depois uma mediação de perguntas, né, mediada pelo Juliano, que já está aqui, para agradecer também seu apoio e a presença. É isso. James, I'll give the word to you. Sorry for the Portuguese. We were just thanking and welcome you to Rio.
Hello. Am I on? You can hear me? Yes. This is a map that I have here of just a small portion of California's Great Central Valley. At the very bottom of the map, which you probably can't read, it says Bakersfield. This is where Merle Haggard and the kind of Bakersfield sound came from. It's a very locked into country western music, and there's oil fields nearby here. This valley itself is 600 miles long and 30 miles across. What you see here is just about 70 miles by 30 miles, so it's just a little section of it. And in 2001, I bought some property up in the Sierra Nevada, right here, if you can see that little red dot. And it's in the town of Pine Flat, a very small mountain town at about 4,000 feet. This is the roof of my house right here. Can you see the arrow? It's right there. And so these are from Google Maps. This is my house. And when I bought the house, it didn't need any work at all. It was in perfect shape, but I didn't like the way the house was. So I tore it all apart and then put it back together, and it took about 9 months. I also built this lower porch was in here, and I also put a room on the first floor here as a guest room, so when you come and visit, you can stay there. The reason I bought the house is I wanted to live kind of on my own in the middle of nowhere and see what solitude would bring. And once I finished the construction, which took about 9 months, then I realized I wasn't quite sure what I could do in the middle of nowhere and what I would do with solitude. So I decided I would try to learn how to paint. And I was very influenced by this painter, Bill Traylor. He was born a slave in Alabama, and after he was freed from slavery, he stayed on the plantation where he worked, and he worked as an indentured servant, and he had about 10 kids. So he worked his whole life as a farmer. And then at the age of 80, he outlived everybody that was on the farm, and his family had moved away. And this was in the 1938. So he moved into Montgomery, Alabama, and he lived on the streets as a homeless man. And from 1939 to 41, he did about 2,000 paintings sitting on the street corner, and here's a picture of him. He was able to live in a back room of a funeral parlor that was run by a black businessman in Montgomery, who gave him space because he needed some help. He ended up dying in poverty, losing a leg to gangrene, and now his paintings sell for about somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 a piece. So I started to copy his paintings, and this is the very first painting I made that it was a copy of his. And unfortunately, it's kind of dark looking. But the interesting thing I learned from him was that if I didn't put the images on the page exactly like he did, it didn't have the power. In other words, he was able to kind of use the negative space around things and react to the flaws in the cardboard that he would paint on. And I thought, oh, it's interesting, he's called an untrained artist, but I thought the way he places the image on a page was probably learned from the way he would plow a field, that he would do contour plowing and plow around the certain parts of the land that would allow the water to flow properly. And I thought that same technique probably is what he used when he placed an image onto a page. So I did about 40 or 50 paintings of his. And I really enjoyed learning his technique and the way he worked. And then I started to think, well, I had such a good time remodeling the house that I thought maybe I'd build a house on my property, another house. And then I thought that was silly. I was a bit too old for that. And then I thought, no, I can build a small house. So I thought, well, I'll build Henry David Thoreau's cottage. Now, I suspect most of you know who Henry David Thoreau is, but he was a 19th century author who wrote the book Walden, and he wrote that book while he lived in a small cabin in the woods outside of Concord, Massachusetts. And it's kind of the quintessential small house, at least known in the U.S. So I thought, oh, I'll just use his house as a design. So I started to, this is Henry David Thoreau. And this is his book Walden, with a sketch on the front of the cover. In Walden itself, Thoreau describes the building of the cottage in in a very detailed way, that it allowed me to know the dimensions of the cabin. There's no photographs of it, but his description was close enough that I could build a cabin that was somewhat of a replica of his. And this is me and in the mountains. There you kind of see the landscape that I live in. It's in the middle of this forest, pine forest. And this is the finished cabin. And then once I finished this, I started to do more paintings by different artists that I liked. This is Mose Tolliver, another black artist from Alabama. He had an unfortunate accident when he was in his 60s. He was very hardworking. He had 11 kids to feed. And a huge weight dropped onto one of his legs and rendered him crippled, and then he became an alcoholic because he was so depressed that he couldn't work. And then somehow somebody introduced him to painting, and he started to paint, and he turned his whole life around. He stopped drinking, and he started painting at like the age of 62 in 1985 or so, or 1980, and he died maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and he worked all that time. And this is a copy of one of his paintings that I made. That's a self-portrait that he did. So it's quite wonderful kind of texture with the brush. And then maybe you've heard of this artist, Henry Darger. He was a Chicago man. He was put into a mental institution when he was a young boy. He escaped 3 times. The first 2 times he returned to the institution, and the 3rd time he walked 180 miles back to Chicago, where he had an aunt, and his aunt found him a job in a hospital, working in the back scenes of a hospital, rolling bandages, things like that. And for the next 60 or 70 years, he lived with these jobs, never took any welfare. And he wrote a 50,000-page novel that he illustrated. The novel's about the Vivian girls who are fighting for freedom of children that are being enslaved. It's quite a remarkable story that he wrote, and then he illustrated that story with large drawings and paintings, and so I started to copy those. And, this is the Vivian girls fighting the army that enslaves children. And these were kind of long, this would be one of like 6 drawings that would be together in a long mural-like setting that he would do. And then at the age of 80 or so, he died, and he just left his boarding house in Chicago. And the 2 people that lived next to him, that rented to him, were astonished when he just left all of his stuff behind. And luckily they were artists themselves, or this probably would have all been thrown away. And these are very famous paintings now also that sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he too pretty much lived in poverty. And then this is Martin Ramirez, a Mexican man who came to the U.S. And he was kind of found on the streets of San Francisco a bit delusional, and he was put into a mental institution for 30 years. And people thought he was mute, but he just couldn't speak English, so he didn't speak to people. And he started to draw and paint in this mental institution and made thousands of drawings and making his own paper and using crayons and color pencils. And this is a copy of one of his drawings. These two are very valuable now. These are all copies, though. I don't own any of the originals. I couldn't afford that. And then this is a drawing that Thoreau made. Thoreau also did, what is it called, surveying for the township of Concord where he lived. And this is one of his drawings of a plot of land that's outside of Concord. And it's a very nice drawing itself. And the frame that I use here is a frame that's made by, it's called tramp art. It was in the 30s when people were riding railroad trains. They would take the wood from wooden cigar boxes and carve them and make different designs out of them, and a number of picture frames still exist. So I found this in an antique store and used that as the frame. I'm sorry the image isn't quite as good as on my computer, so you can't really see the detail of the carving, but it's quite wonderful. Anyway, I put those paintings into the Thoreau cabin, and at that point I thought, oh, I'm not just building a house and I'm not learning how to paint, but I'm actually starting to make something that I felt was an art piece about outsiderness and about solitude. But when I hung those six paintings of them in the Thoreau cabin, I felt like it was missing something. It needed some kind of counterpoint. That it was a bit cute. It didn't have an edge to it, and which led to a particular dilemma, I thought. And then I thought, well, I had this same problem back in 1984 when I made the film American Dreams. I don't know if you're familiar with this film. I'm sure it's online. Somebody put it on there. And it's a film that I made starting in the early 80s by collecting baseball cards of Henry Aaron. He was my boyhood hero. And my daughter, who in the early 80s was about 7 or 8 years old, was a huge baseball fan. So we started to go to baseball card conventions. And I started to buy the cards of Henry Aaron. And then I got very obsessive and I wanted to get every card that was ever made for Henry Aaron. And so I spent 2 or 3 years searching. This was before the internet, where you couldn't find things so easily. So I'd go to all of these baseball card conventions, and I ended up buying all of Henry Aaron's cards. And then I thought, oh, I'll make a film with it. And what I did is I decided I would put them in the order that they were produced. Henry Aaron started playing baseball in 1954, and he retired in '76. So that was so many years of baseball cards that I had. And those happened to be the years of my coming of age. So I decided what I would do is I would show the fronts of the cards for the first year in 1954, and I would play a political speech from that year over the fronts of the cards. And then I'd show you the backs of the cards, and I would play a popular music piece from that year that was among the top 10 songs and selling on the charts. And so I ended up with that idea that I would have all of the cards from 54 to 75, and I would have political speeches from each of those years, and I would have a song from each of those years. But at that point, I also thought, oh, this project is too cute, it needs some kind of counterpoint to it. So then I thought about a man from Milwaukee called Arthur Bremer. And Arthur Bremer was about my age. And in 1972, he wanted to become infamous, so he was stalking Nixon when Nixon was running for president. And he wanted to kill Nixon. But he got very frustrated because he couldn't get near to him. So instead he switched and started to stalk George Wallace, who was a kind of a right-wing candidate that was a segregationist from Alabama. And he ended up shooting him, crippling him. And Wallace was kind of like a Trump candidate in 1972. He had great support, but he was rendered crippled. He dropped out of the race and didn't run. And Arthur Bremer was captured and put in jail, and he was released a few years ago. So I thought what I'd do is I would write a diary. I would make up a diary that Bremer would have kept while he was stalking Nixon and then switching to Wallace. So I went to the Milwaukee Public Library to do research on Bremer. And the first thing I found is that he had a diary. He kept a diary himself, and that it was confiscated. It was found in his car when he was caught shooting Wallace. So I was able to check the book out, and I thought, oh, this makes my job quite easy. I don't have to make up a diary. There's one that exists. So I made a handwritten kind of edit of that to make it readable within a 1 hour film. And I animated the diary through the bottom of this film. So now I had both the political speeches, the cards, and the music, and then it had this counterpoint of text of a person that was my age from my hometown that had committed this atrocious act. And the film started to resonate for me that it had this counterpoint, that there was kind of a good and a bad, the hero and the anti-hero that works with it. And it's one of my favorite films. I don't know if many of you have seen it. But anyways, because I had done this, and this is Henry Aaron, who the cards were after and my childhood hero. And this is Arthur Bremer right after he was arrested in the back seat with an FBI agent. Bremer's the one with his head on the shoulder. So for the cabin projects, I decided, well, I needed a counterpoint to the Thoreau cabin. So I decided to build a second cabin, and this one would be the cabin of Ted Kaczynski. Now, I'm not sure you know who he is, but this is him in 1970. He grew up in Chicago. He's also the same age as me. He's from a working class family like me. He studied mathematics like myself, although he was quite more intelligent than me. He went to Harvard at the age of 16, got a PhD from the University of Michigan, and his dissertation won the best dissertation of that year when he graduated. It couldn't even be evaluated by his own professors. They had to bring in people from I believe, San Francisco, from Berkeley. The math department there is quite great. And they immediately awarded him the best dissertation of the year and hired him. He taught there for a couple of years and then saved enough money to quit and move to Montana and live in the middle of nowhere. And this is him as he's moving to Montana. And this is him in 1995 when he's arrested as the Unabomber. I don't know if you know who the Unabomber is, but he's the person who terrified the U.S. Domestic terrorist, sending bombs through the mail, putting a bomb on an airline at one point, and writing a manifesto that was about anti-technology. It's quite brilliant because it kind of warns us what we're becoming, especially with what cell phones do to us, and the kind of attention we put to those machines. Anyway, I thought, well, he would be an interesting counterpoint. This is his cabin. It's in an FBI storage facility here, and it's a picture taken by Richard Barnes, a art photographer. He had access to it, and it was being stored here when Kaczynski, after he was caught, there was a trial. They wanted to introduce this cabin as his defense to prove that he was insane, and Kaczynski himself didn't want that as a defense because he didn't believe he was insane. He believed in his own anti-tech philosophy, and he wrote a manifesto that was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and his brother recognized some of the language in that text, and that's how he was caught by the FBI. And so I thought, well, I'll build this cabin, and it's easy to build because Richard Barnes took a number of photographs and it could easily scale it down. So I built the second cabin, and this is my cabin in the winter of the first year that it was built, and it's about maybe 60 meters from the Thoreau cabin, but it's in the trees, so one can't see one cabin from the other. And then I started to do more paintings to put into this cabin. This is Jesse Howard, who is a Missouri farmer, and he littered his property with political signs and religious signs, and they became I think he had a show before he died, but they've become much more popular since then. Text artists like Jenny Holzer was very much influenced by the texts that these text signs that he made, and I copied one of them, and it's in the Kaczynski cabin. This is one of his signs, and it's about fallout shelters. And the reason I use this particular sign in the Kaczynski cabin is because in some of his writings, Kaczynski wrote the government to find out how to build a fallout shelter. And then I also did some paintings by Joseph Yoakum, who was a Chicago artist who, as a young boy, traveled the world in the circus, and he did these wonderful paintings that are kind of sexualized landscapes. And this is one of his paintings, which is done with ballpoint pen and watercolor. And this is Missouri Petway. She's a black woman from Alabama who was part of the Gee's Bend Quilt Collective. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're a group of black women in the early 1900s that started to make quilts out of necessity because they lived they're an descendants of slaves, and they lived on the Alabama River that would make a curve like this that made them geographically isolated. And because of that geographic isolation, the black people at Gee's Bend kept their African roots, and their quilt designs were very much based on African art. And she made some really wonderful quilts, and I copied one of her quilts to put into the Kaczynski cabin. And this is the copy that I made of Missouri Petway's quilt using jean material that I bought in California's Central Valley. So these are bought from thrift stores. So they're the clothing of migrant workers that work in the Central Valley. And this is Black Hawk, who was a Plains Indian from the 1880s, who pretty much supported his family during the 1880s when there were droughts in Iowa where he lived by doing drawings and paintings. And he would hallucinate from fasting for 10 days, and then he would paint what he saw. And this is a copy of one of his paintings. And they all were done on found paper. So I found some old texts from the 1880s to draw on, just like he did. And this is Miroslav Tushy, who built his own cameras. You can see he's holding the camera there. And people thought that they weren't real cameras, so they thought he was crazy. But he was actually quite a great artist. And so he could film anywhere because of his kind of clumsiness. And I didn't build my own camera, but I was able to take a photo of one of his photos. And so, I don't know why that happened. Jeepers. So this is one of his photos. And this is one of drawing by Ted Kaczynski himself, just kind of. So I did a copy of that. A few years ago, the FBI auctioned off everything that was found in Kaczynski's cabin. And a friend of mine who's a fairly successful artist, Jan Vo, knew that I was interested in Kaczynski, and he bid on and bought all of Kaczynski's notebooks. So I had access to all of his writings while he was in his cabin, and a number of those writings were done in a numbered code, and which was impossible to decode. But fortunately, Kaczynski also left a 9 or 10-page dissertation on how to decode his coded messages. So when Jan Vo bought all of his diaries, and some of them were in code, we also had the instructions on how to decode those diaries. So I wrote a computer program then to help me decode the series of numbers that would come up in these decoded messages. And so once I finished the Kaczynski cabin and the Thoreau cabin, I thought I had really a valuable piece of art that was site-specific, and that it really talked about outsiderness, and it made this interesting comparison between Thoreau and Kaczynski. And at first I thought of it in the sense of the baseball card movie, that Thoreau was the good guy and Kaczynski was the bad guy. But the more research I did on Thoreau, I realized that he was a radical himself, his mother and his sister, and he helped run the Underground Railroad to get slaves to Canada that were escaping from the South. And he also supported John Brown, who was a religious fanatic that actually perhaps was the catalyst to start the Civil War when he invaded Harper's Ferry to take over the arsenal of guns and give them to slaves. And he was caught, and Thoreau, to the day that John Brown was hung, was in his corner writing positive things about John Brown. So it was interesting to me to see that Thoreau had this radical side to him. And then it was also interesting to read all of Kaczynski's journals and his manifesto, to see that he had a lot of things about the environment and about nature itself that were very close to Thoreau's thinking. So now all of a sudden these two men that I thought were both good and evil, where there is a connection between the two, and they actually, by looking at one, you could understand the other. And that was very exciting to me. And then, so I thought, well, I have a very valuable art piece as an installation in the middle of the Sierra Nevada. And what do I do now? I can invite people to come up, and I invite you all to come visit me, if you can find it. So the first thing I thought, well, I'll make a film. And I made a film called Two Cabins. It's a short half-hour film, and the first 15 minutes is a shot out of the Thoreau cabin window. Now, notice my Thoreau cabin, I used designer windows in it because when I built the first cabin, I didn't realize I was doing an art project that was going to represent Thoreau completely. So I just used the design of that cabin to not religiously. So in here you can see these very beautiful windows compared to what the Thoreau cabin would have had. Anyways, for the film Two Cabins, it's a 15-minute film, And the first 15 minutes is just simply this shot looking out the window, and you hear the sounds of nature outside the window. And then the second 15 minutes is the shot out of the window in the Kaczynski cabin, and it's for 15 minutes too, and you hear the noise from the Kaczynski cabin. But what I had done is I went up to Lincoln, Montana, where Kaczynski's actual cabin is, and for the 15 minutes of sound here, you don't hear the sound that's taken at my replica cabin in California, but you actually hear the sound from Lincoln, Montana. And the same thing I did with the Thoreau window. I went to Concord, and where the exact location where Thoreau's cabin was built at Walden Pond, and recorded the sound there. So you hear that actual sound. And I was when I was at the Walden Pond, I wanted to make sure I got a recording that would include the railroad train that goes near Walden Pond, because in Walden, Thoreau has a chapter on the railroad that was newly built at that time in the early 1840s. So it's this kind of beautiful essay on what he felt the technology of the railroad would do to the marketplace and the way we lived our lives. So I wanted to make sure that the railroad was included in this film. So this was the first thing I could actually show now that that represented the Two Cabins project. And then this project was built as an installation. This is in my gallery in Berlin, Neuger Riebenschneider, where the two shots are played at the same time. And then I have two pedestals. The one here is built out of plywood, the same material that was used for the wall here. And the pedestal here is lath and plaster, which is the same that I used in the cast here. And then this is a copy of the Thoreau's desk. So here's the pedestal in the same plywood, and on top of that is the same kind of typewriter that Kaczynski wrote his manifesto in, that was published in the New York Times and ended up getting him caught. And this is a copy that I made of Thoreau's desk, which the original desk is in Concord, so you can, there's plans on the internet that give you the exact dimensions of this, so it's quite easy to copy. And this is the pedestal that's lath and plaster. And then after this installation was done, my good friend Julie Alt, who's a remarkable artist and a curator and a writer, wanted to do a book about the Two Cabins project, so she was the editor for the book, and the book is called Two Cabins. Let me open it here. It's quite a wonderful book. It begins with an essay on solitude by Henry David Thoreau. And then it has an excerpt from Kaczynski's manifesto. So it begins with writing by both Thoreau and Kaczynski. And then there's a series of photographs that I took. This is the path between the two cabins. So to get from the Thoreau cabin to the Kaczynski cabin, this is taken kind of from the point of view of the Thoreau cabin, and you'd walk through here, the Kaczynski cabins down there. And then this is the Thoreau cabin in the winter. Some of these photos I've already shown you. And these are catalogs of the artists that I copied, and these are photographs that I took of catalogs of their work. And this is a built trailer drawing that's in the catalog, and then this is the 3 built trailers that are in the cabin. Here's the one copied from that catalog. And this one was the very first one that I showed you already. And then some of these things you've already seen. This is a fireplace in the Thoreau cabin. And other pictures, paintings, and that. This is the interior of the Kaczynski cabin with the Black Hawk drawing here. Let me get through these though. And then in the Kaczynski cabin, I also have a library. When Kaczynski was arrested, they found 278 books in his cabin. And I got the listing of those books, and I realized I owned about a third of those because he and I went to the university at the same time. He went to Harvard, I went to the University of Wisconsin, which is a public university that we got kind of the reading list trickled down from Harvard. So, and then when I made my own library in the Kaczynski cabin, I used all the books that we had in common, and then I also used books that we didn't have in common, both from my library and from his. And there's so then in the book there's description of the cabin, and then there's description of the paintings that are in each cabin. So it's getting boring about yeah, and then this is the stacks of books that are in there. I don't know if we should go through all those, but I should point out maybe a few of them. Anyway, and then there's also a text by Julie Alt in the book, and also a text by Dick Hebditch, who's famous for his writings on subcultures that he wrote in the late 70s, early 80s. He wrote a nice text about this too. So it's quite a wonderful book. Unfortunately, it's out of print now. That it was a small edition, I think, of 2000, and they're all done. And then I also wrote biographies of each of the people that like Mose Tolliver, etc. So I'll go out of that. So that was the kind of opening up of the project. Besides the two cabins installation, and the book came out, and we did a book launch in Berlin and in New York and in Los Angeles and a number of places. And then this is the Kunsthaus in Graz, Austria. Peter Package, who was the director of the museum at the time, wanted to do a whole museum show of the Two Cabins project. And his first idea was that we would lift the cabins off the ground and bring them to Austria. And my reaction to that was no, we won't do that. So what I decided, rather than do that, we would do architectural renderings of each of the cabins. And you know these little white architectural renderings. But I thought we'd do them life-size, so that's what we did. This is the Kaczynski cabin as a white architectural rendering, but life-size, so you can walk inside it. So it isn't at all about the materials, but it's about the space that exists inside the cabin. And then we also, the show in Graz had a lot of different things and paintings, and all the paintings were in it also. But we also did a 2-screen installation of RR, which is my 16 millimeter film that was projected on one wall. I don't know if you know this film, it's been shown. And the interesting thing about this 2-screen installation was that the projector was right in the museum, so it would be in the room. So this was the 16 millimeter side. And then I made a film called DNSF, which is digital train film that I made in the Mojave Desert. That's 3 hours and 15 minutes long, and it's just one shot, and 13 trains go by in one shot, where RR is 43 different trains in places all over the U.S. There's a great difference between the two, and in this one, the length of each shot is determined by the train. It starts with the train entering the frame and then ending the frame. It ends when the train exits the frame. And then you see the next train. So it's not about waiting at all, but in BNSF, it's a 3 hour and 15-minute film where 13 trains go through. So you wait, and then a train goes through, then you wait, another train goes through. And so it was shot digitally, and this is on the opposite wall where the projector is hidden up above. So it's very clean installation, where this is more about the material of the film. And so there's a direct comparison between 16 millimeter image and the digital image. I like this piece of quite a bit. And then that same show traveled to the Kunsthaus in Hamburg, Germany, and that's this. And here's the Thoreau cabin built as a mock-up, and here's one of the Giesben quilts, which is also in the show. So there's like about 70 different pieces in this show, so I'm not going to show all of those. In both of the one in Hamburg and in Austria. And then I made a film called Stempel Pass, which just deals with the Kaczynski cabin. This film is taken, this is one of there's 4 shots in the film, each shot is a half hour. I think this is the fall shot, yes. So it's the second shot in the film. And it's a half hour long, and it starts with about 2 or 3 minutes of just, you look at the landscape, and then for the next 15 minutes I read from Kaczynski's diaries. And I read from different times of his diaries. The early diaries are about him moving to Montana, and then he begins by learning how to hunt and gather. So the very early diaries are very interesting about how to live off the land. And then slowly the diaries become dark, and he wants to kill people, and he's very obsessed with. He's very angry, and then the diaries change. That anger becomes focused with a meaning of anti-technology, and so then the diaries start to talk about technology. So they're very interesting, and so in each of the 4 sections, I read from 4 different places in those diaries. For 15 minutes, and then you watch for 15 minutes without the diary. And so once the diary is read, the way you look at the landscape is completely coded by the diary that I've just read. I'm sorry I'm doing such a lousy job. You should see the film. It's a quite marvelous film. So this was another project that came out of that. And then I also made a film just about the Thoreau cabin called Concord Woods, where I read 2 different essays from Thoreau, and this is just 2 shots that are each an hour long. And one is done in the springtime and one is done in the fall. So they're kind of companion pieces, and they were both also installed in those museum shows I just showed you. And then this is Vancouver Art Gallery that had a group show called Cabin Fever. So they reproduced the 2 architectural mock-ups, and this is kind of a beautiful shot of the museum with the Kaczynski cabin in the doorway. And then this was in Latvia at the Siez Art Fair, and I was able to do an installation in this. This is an old brewery that's been closed down, so I built a 2 cabins piece inside here, and this is where you see both of the 2 cabins, and one of the cheese bend quilts here, and then a projection of a burnt out area in the Sierra Nevada that was almost burned by a house down. And this is back to that aerial photo of my house. This is the house here. And this is the Kaczynski cabin right here. And this little white reflection is the reflection of the sun off of the window of the Thoreau cabin. So the Thoreau cabin's here, and this is that pathway I showed you down to the Kaczynski cabin here. And this is the Kaczynski cabin taken this year after it's, I guess it's 12 years old now or more. And I think I'll stop there. How did we do? 2? That's pretty good. One of the reasons, I think it becomes obvious that what I wanted to illustrate with this lecture is a process of working, how my work comes out of my real life and what I'm interested in, and then it grows as I'm working on it. And one project leads into another, So I hope you could feel that, the actual progression of the work and how it starts to speak to itself and regenerate itself.
At first, I'll say it's a pleasure to be here. It's thank you for ECRÃ for inviting me. Well, I think it's very grateful to see this pack of young people interested in James Bend's words. I am part of an online magazine called Revista Cinética. We published 9 years ago a bunch of texts about Annie's works. You can check it online. We have shown in Instituto Moreira Salles 2016 natural history, and I mean, it's very happy to be part of this. Thank you, ECRÃ, for this time here. And since we have like 1 hour left, I think I'll make like some starting questions here, and then I share with you for your questions. I suppose you're here to talk with them. And James, I'd like to ask you something about that has a relation to what you've shown here. Because at first I wanted to ask you about, since I've watched yesterday United States of America, and it's kind of a remake of the film you made with Eddie Gordon, like 40 years ago, kind of. And you have other remakes in your work, but seeing what you said today here, I feel that more than a remake as a form of making films, I see you're interested in something around, I don't know, reproducting things, and to see the effect of trying to make things again, and the difference between like the original and this exercise of remaking. If you could talk a bit about remaking and reproduction, because it's interesting. It's something that we don't find a very common way, and it's a characteristic of commercial cinema. We are like in a huge atmosphere today of the nostalgia and everything, like remaking things, and I think your work tries to deal with remaking and reproduction in an interesting way. If you could comment on that, I think it's interesting.
Well, yeah, that's a big subject. What can I say? Well, what I found interesting was when I first started to copy Bill Traylor's paintings, and when I found that if I didn't put them on the page exactly the same way he did, that it lost the power. And then he had discovered something about negative space and placement. And then when I came to this conclusion that it probably came from his own skills as a farmer and the way he worked with land, that opened up a whole new way of thinking for me about what the word untrained means, because it neglects real skills that can be brought to art from other places. And then the other thing that I learned quite quickly was, especially with Bill Traylor, because he's a huge man, big hands, and he had at times done very delicate work that I would have a hard time. I'd have to lean and figure out a way to do something because it was so delicate and to put it in such a way. So I started to feel like I could be inside the person. And I thought that was really interesting. I felt what his problem was, and then I wasn't sure I found the same solution to the problem, but I was confronted with the same problem. So I found that to be very interesting. And so it wasn't really about making the work, it was about these discoveries along the way to make the work. And then I kind of got good at it, so I was kind of proud of how they kind of looked like the work. But I also was more proud of what I learned of the skill and the technique and how I felt that you kind of feel like you're that person for a moment. But I remade Easy Rider, and I remade Faces in two completely different kinds of ways. So I'm also interested in reproducing, not directly, but in a more kind of creative way. With Faces, the John Cassavetes film, I took the film and I did an analysis. I broke it down into so many scenes. And then if the first scene had two people in it, then I would break that scene down into what percentage of the scene was focused on one and what percentage on the other. And then since the film was called Faces, I only wanted to reproduce it with faces. But then I try to reproduce it with the same amount of time that each person had in the original film, but just with their face. So, for instance, if the first scene had two people in it, and one was in it 80% of the time and one was 20%, then I had to fill up that 80% of that time just with a shot of the face. So I'd have to look for a shot, and then I could slow it down to make it that length. So I started to play games with actual time within a film to reduce a film called Faces to Faces. So it was this kind of setting up rules to remake it, and you end up with a completely different kind of film. It isn't about the drama that's in it, but it's about the drama that exists in those faces, and then how that drama is changed by changing the timing of the shot, by slowing it down. So I started to think about all different things rather than what Faces was actually about.
I see. I know you have lots of films. I think I know from the ones from the early 70s. So there's plenty of films, and the ones I have the opportunity to know are different between them. Different techniques, different approaches, different concepts. But since you brought the word drama, I think I would like to ask you about that word, because sometimes when we watch, especially, I mean, some more your works that deal with stable shots and long shots, and sometimes when we discuss experimental work, we like oppose that to drama, their work. And when I see your films, I mean, as an example, the film we watched yesterday, United States of America, we can see, like, I can feel a very detailed work of producing, like, expectation, surprise, and you know, and we have, like, the show yesterday. People were laughing. I thought it was great, because this was like a proof of somehow an emotional connection that reveals that. So I like to ask you about that, building that somehow drama effects, but not in the conventional way. But I feel that in your work. In some works it's more clear, in the other ones not that, but I feel it's always there, like producing surprise, expectation, and laughter.
Well, that's an interesting idea, to look at all 52 shots and try to describe what the drama is in each shot. I'll take a few shots that I think are very full of drama. I mean, I think maybe the one that's the most dramatic is this 4 horses that are just staring ahead, and you hear some dogs barking and a chainsaw in the distance, and so you know there's other kinds of life going on, and yet these horses, they're almost like the Blair Witch Project, staring somebody told him don't move, you know. When I went to do the shot, they were very curious about me, and I set up the camera, and they all came over. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to work. They just want to say hello. But they got bored with me quite quickly because I didn't do it. I didn't say hello back. And I just stood there. And then when I came, they were standing. I don't know if it was cold or what they were doing, but they were frightening me. And then they did it again. But there was even a stronger drama in the shot that I didn't use. Because the black horse that's staring this way, it's staring at the brown horse. And after about I filmed them for quite a long time because I wasn't sure what I would use. That horse finally slowly walks up to the other horse, and it takes its head and it tries to just brush its head against the kind of leg. And that horse doesn't want that to happen, quick turns away. And then this horse turns and tries to do again, and then it does the same thing, and then it turns this way, and then they stare again. So this horse is really in love with that horse. It was such a sad love story. And I thought, oh, this is just too much for my film. But, so there was even more of a drama that was going on. And I mean, maybe my favorite shot in the film is Vermont, which is just these trees covered with snow. And if you look very closely, every once in a while, the wind makes some snow drop here and drop there. If you have to work hard on the film, if you don't, you miss those really dramatic moments. There's also the young boy that's fishing with a little dog, and I was sitting way in the back row, so I couldn't even see the dogs. So it also depends how close you are to the image to see some of those things that are hidden. Do you know which shot I'm talking about? He had a yellow shirt on. It's for Missouri, and it's along the river. And he's actually fishing, but you have to look real close to see that he's. So I like those kinds of hidden dramas. And he was so content. And he was a young black kid, and I was surprised because where I was shooting, there not many black people lived there, so it was kind of interesting. And I was using it for Missouri because it looked like a river that I lived in Missouri for a few years. It looked very much like where I lived, and there were black people where I lived, so I thought, oh, this is interesting. Somehow he showed up for me to make me feel at home.
And, well, using the film we watched yesterday, it's something that it's related to what I've just had. We have like a very somehow bold presence of politics as the Stokely Carmichael speech, and especially in texts in a very literal way. And I feel that through your films I have the opportunity to watch politics and history are kind of always there. And most of the times you said the expression hidden drama. I see you work with that in different ways, but there's always like I don't know, around the film or maybe a bit hidden some layers of history and make sometimes bold politics issues. And if you could comment on that, because I mean, when we saw maybe some words that deals with very direct things, we don't imagine all these layers that they are somehow hidden. And if you could comment a bit on that, because I feel that through different words, you're always related to that somehow.
Let me think. In the late 1960s, I was living in Springfield, Missouri, and I was doing organizing in this kind of black-white ghetto. It's very small, near the downtown area. Really bad poverty, a lot of alcoholism. And I was there for a year and a half, and we started a dropout school. And we're trying to get kids back into school. We had a pool table, and they play pool together, and then I talked to them about geometry and things like that. And while I was there was a convention, a kind of an underground convention of people that were doing organizing in different parts of the U.S. And the convention was in Denver, so I went to Denver. And I met Rennie Davis there, who was one of the Chicago 7. And he was, at the time, organizing a poor white ghetto in Chicago. And we were all talking about our particular communities and what was the, and a lot of things were the same. And how can we get people jobs and things like that. Anyway, while I was at that convention, or underground convention, I went to a camera store in Denver, and I bought a 8mm Bolex. It looks exactly like a 16mm. Because I didn't think if I made films, I couldn't afford 16, so 8mm camera. And then I took it back, and it was really hard work where I was living, and I was 25 years old, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life. It was consuming me. But I had this camera, and now I'm living in the middle of this poverty and in the middle of this idea of organizing. And I thought, okay, I want to make films, but I can't make political films, because if I'm going to do something political, it should be where I am. I can't leave here. So I thought, okay, I'll make films and it won't be political, but that was impossible, because what I learned from the short time that I was doing kind of radical things, those politics don't leave you, or you become kind of a fraud. So slowly, as I made films, politics came back into it, but I never wanted to make films that were dogmatic and told you how to behave. I wanted to make films that showed you things and asked you how do you live your life, that kind of thing. So that's what I think the politics of my film getting kind of shaky. I'm still guilty about not being where I used to be. But it was killing me.
As a last question of mine here, I would like to ask you about, because something that strikes me in watching your films, especially in big screens, is that they want me to have an exercise of intense attention to them. I must pay attention. And attention is something that is also historical. I mean, people to spend their time to watch and to see one single thing for 1 hour, for 30 minutes, for 2 hours, something that I feel that is more and more difficult to pay attention to a single thing. And I feel that your work through the decades, it's, I don't know if it's your intention, but it's becoming more and more political in that sense, because it's a lot about paying attention. Yesterday I was watching, you have to pay, to relate intensely to the dynamics of the thing. It's good if you see the small guy who's fishing, but it's not clear. But you have to do that attention work. So I don't know if it's something that goes through your mind or not, but watching the work, for me, it's a lot about attention. And I think it's something that moving images somehow can do and can relate as something that is more important today than ever, I think. So if you got a good comment about your work on attention, people paying attention to something, I think it's a nice topic.
Well, for me, the most important things in life are subtle. It's very subtle things that happen. And if you aren't sensitive, you don't see any subtlety, and your life becomes kind of bland. So yesterday, a few people left in the beginning, and I think, well, I didn't get them. They didn't kind of give it a chance. And I understand that, because it's hard work. But once you learn that subtlety gives back, then it's worth the hard work. But if you don't look close, you think, are we just marking time here? Okay, this is a minute and 45 seconds. So, it's kind of feel that I want people to see things closer, smaller details, excitement. And I think I learned mostly from observations. I also read about things, but I don't know what to read about if I don't observe first.
And since I have one more minute, if we use like an example, the United States of America, the remake we watched yesterday, you commented about the shot of the horses, that you said like you arrive there and you have you spent some time before shooting. If you could comment a bit about the way you work in that kind of situation, about your physical presence in the place of you're going to shoot before shooting. How is that important? If you want to use the film we watched yesterday, but if you can comment on others, but I feel that somehow important in your practice.
It's always different. For instance, when I shot the homeless people under the bridge, I shot that at 7:30 in the morning, and I was very nervous because I didn't feel good about it. And I didn't want to wake people up and say, hey, I'm going to set a camera up. And then the woman got out. I don't show her getting out of the tent, but I show her when she's out of the tent. And she doesn't even see me. She just walks through. And then later I was putting things away, and she came back. She went to buy some cigarettes. And she asked me if I had a light. I was putting equipment away. I said, no, I don't smoke. I said, what are you going to do today? And she said, well, it's my day off. And I thought that was so stupid. And then we talked for a while, and she was very nice, and I thought, okay, if you can be yourself to somebody, people kind of open up to you. But also, I would, I don't know if I want to be filmed either. And then you're in a delicate situation. But I also want to show things that are really in the world, and I don't want to ignore things because but there's moral issues there. So yeah, I could still feel a little queasy about it.
Well, so if someone have a question.
So one thing that I found really interesting in your masterclass about Thoreau and the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski is this concept of solitude. And I know your last film that we watched at the Cinemateca yesterday was a remake of a film that you did with Betty Gordon. And I keep thinking about the difference between you directing a film with somebody, you working with other people, and you working alone. And I wanted to ask if you think the concept of solitude, like in Thoreau and Kaczynski, is the ideal model of you to work as an artist in general. And if you think, for example, as you start to get older, as you start your career starts to grow, do you think that solitude became important to you to become focused on your work, focus as an artist? And that was what I want to ask, because I know there are some films that we work with other people, like the United States of America. There are films like 20 Cigarettes and Readers, where you have to work with actors and other filmmakers. But I want to ask you if you think the idea, the feeling of solitude is an inherent part of being an artist, being a filmmaker. So
I don't know how to really answer why I wanted to address solitude. I just felt it was a place I needed to be. And I mean, my life is weird because I can be very social, traveling like this or teaching. But I also have a need to not be traveling and teaching, and to kind of be confronted by just who I am and what I'm doing. So I have a really hard time working with other people because I'm too dogmatic about what to do. I always get in fights, which I don't like to do. I just finished making a book with Martin Beck was the designer, the same designer that did Two Cabins, and with Sharon Lockhart and I, we're having a show. I had a show in Milwaukee, and it was supposed to be a whole year long, and it only was a half year because of COVID, and now the second half is happening. And the show is always set up to change in the middle, and it was called overtime, so 6 months of one thing, and then we changed the whole show to another. And I'm very close with Sharon. Our work, we speaks to each other, and yet it's hard to work together because we both are so sure about what we want, and it's hard to compromise. I don't know. I love that when people can do that. It's hard for me. But I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, because you always talk about, in your personal story, about, and your interest too, about politics, and in a very radical way, I think, in a very active way. But at the same time, you have a great interest in solitarism. I'd like to know how these two things coexist in you and in your work, maybe over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think from experiencing solitude, you really look inward a lot. You get to learn more about yourself. maybe that allows me to figure out how I feel about things politically once you know yourself better. I think there's a connection to kind of activism and the opposite of that. How I get to know myself better so then I can do something outside. But as I practice more, I mean, I apply it more to my films now than to any kind of activism politically out in the world. It's kept inside my films that hopefully inspire maybe some other people to think a little bit different, or help themselves get through the day in a better way. Ask me, how can I answer this better?
I would like, I guess I talked a little bit about this with you yesterday, but I'd like to extend that a little. There's something in your movies that sort of calls for something that I don't know how to name precisely, but I would say some sort of presence. And I'd like to ask you if you think that this challenge that you invite us in terms of perception and sensual experience, if you consider that as something political too, not just in terms of political discourse, but as an experience, the political experience that is fundamentally challenging to our perception.
Well, I hope it does that. I hope that any experience you have with the film helps you become a better person, and that's very political. Become better and treat people better. I'm hoping that it happens. It's up to you, though, right?
Hi, my name is Bruno, and I was thinking about something that Juliano once said me, that is how he likes films that had the chance to be everything or nothing, you know. Since he talked to me about this, I really start to think almost daily about it, because I'm also a filmmaker, and something that I was thinking after seeing your film yesterday is, do you, like, after so many films and experience, do you still feel this kind of rush or anxiety when you're starting this new project? Like, because I think your films are really strong statements considering the context that we are living in cinema worldwide. Like, they are not films that exist in the vacuum. They exist in a relation with the world and with the people and with bigger things. So I really think that when people say that the pacing, the tension or presence, all these terms that people are saying here, I really think that they can be seen in a political way because of this. Because of this thing that the works are in a relation with this worldwide context. But my two questions. The first one is that, like, how do you feel when you start this new project? Like, do you feel more like very secure and not so much of this rush, like what I'm going to do, how this is going to relate with people or not, or how it's going to
affect, how this is going to exist in this world. And a second question is, do you feel that your work in some kind of way shaped yourself, the way you see the world, and your certainties and your doubts, like how this changed across your life, you know? I don't know if the questions are too abstract, but it's hard to put in words what I'm trying to say, but yes, it's this.
I think I know what you're getting at. When I start something new, I'm generally pretty excited because it mostly it comes in a moment. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you about the newest things. I just finished a film. I've been shooting for a year in Allensworth, which is in the Central Valley. I'm up in the mountains on the map, and then down in the Central Valley is a place called Allensworth. And it was built in 1909. It started by 3 black men from Los Angeles that wanted to start their own town, that they could live outside of the kind of apartheid that they were experiencing in Los Angeles and in most of the U.S. And so they bought farmland and they decided to build a town there. And I mean, it's kind of a long story. They started it, and the interesting thing is I live in Tulare County in the mountains, and that county goes down into the Central Valley. So Allensworth is on one end of the county, and I'm on the other end. And up where I live, I built 2 cabins right there. And Allensworth fell apart. And it's a long story, I won't go into that, but it was basically racism that destroyed the place. And in 1973, a number of the people that were born there petitioned and got it to be a state park. And they rebuilt the town as a ghost town, basically. It's 20 buildings or so. And so when I knew of Allensworth, and I went down there, and then I thought, this is so interesting that I have the replicas of these 2 cabins, and they have a replica of the whole town. And it's so disconnected. And Tulare County is interesting because it was settled by Southerners around and before the Civil War. So there was great racism in that county, and that's one of the reasons this town was eliminated. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting that it's stuff that I've been working with, and there's a little connection. So at that moment, I thought, I'm going to make a film there, and then I got very excited. So it's about like discovering something and then thinking, oh, it's a film I cannot not make because it makes such sense that I have to make this. So I went there and I did a shot, one shot a month over a year, so you see the climate change over the year, and you see the different buildings. And one of the shots in the film, they built a church, they built a school, they built a library, they had a hotel, they had a barber shop, they had a store. So there's all these different kinds of buildings. So I'm filming those. And then I decided that I wanted to use this film to reference other black history. And so as the film grows, I get more and more excited because it kind of opens up. So I ended up, there's a black poet named Lucille Clifton, who I didn't know about, and because I thought I want a young girl to be reading poetry that's written kind of contemporary today, that would be reading it in the school, so it would cross kind of histories, mix them up. And then I also want the young girl to wear this kind of iconic dress that's from a photo, a famous photo from Little Rock, Arkansas, when the schools were integrated. And so that would reference this integration of schools in Little Rock and how the problems of that. And so I had a dress made that's exactly the same kind of dress that's in this famous photograph or this thing. So I got excited about that, and now I finished that film, and now I thought, oh, I'm going to do something using clothing. I'm going to make more iconic clothing. So I just bought a pea coat that I found online that's exactly the same kind of pea coat Patty Hearst had on when she was caught robbing a bank. Do you know who Patty Hearst is? She's the granddaughter of William Hearst from Citizen Kane. But she was kidnapped by radicals and then became one of them and became a bank robber, and then finally got caught, finally was put in jail for a number of years, and then Jimmy Carter pardoned her because of the awful things she went through when she was kidnapped. Anyway, so now I'm doing another project with clothing, so things grow from kind of like this, things grew from one another now. So that's really exciting for me. I don't get nervous, I get really excited when one idea just sparks. And then you had a second part to the question, right?
How do you feel your work shape your life?
Well, yeah. I mean, just the way of working that I realized that I had so much invested in looking and listening, and having teach a class where we look and listen, and that so that makes me see different, and I learn from that. So the process always hopefully makes me grow in a way that I learn something, I learn a way of working, a way of thinking, a way of reacting, a way of communicating. But I think your question is important because it's about process and about that. What I was trying to show here today is this process of how things grow from. And when I began like this, I began just by remodeling my house. I had no idea it was going to end up to this. And then it's connected to this new project down the hill, which is a coincidence. That's kind of wonderful.
Well, first I would like to thank you for your film yesterday and your generosity this morning. It has been really something that will stay with me. You were saying during your intervention that you studied math, and well, I was really happy to hear that because in a sense it explains certain things. And I would like to know, well, seeing the film yesterday, I can sense some symmetry, some beautiful way of images expanding. And I would like to know up to what extent mathematics have accompanied you throughout your work. Sometimes we, like in cinema or art, tend to overlook the beauty of math, but I think it's something very powerful. So I would like to know if math kept with you and if you kept the interest in research and science also.
My favorite proof is a proving that the square root of 2 is irrational. And I could do it right now, but what I like about it is the idea an irrational number is a number that can't be expressed as the quotient of 2 integers. In other words, it can't be made a fraction. And it can be expressed as a decimal, but the decimals go on forever, like pi, 3.14159265535. It keeps going on. And it can be approximated by 3 1/7, but that's a rational number. That it can't be written as a fraction. And that idea that a number can be irrational is very complex, I think. And yet you can prove that the square root of 2 is irrational with very simple algebra. So it's my favorite proof because it's a very abstract notion that a number can't exist as a fraction, but that it can be proved simply with very simple algebra. You assume that it's rational, and then it leads to a contradiction, so your assumption is wrong, and if it isn't rational, it has to be irrational. That's kind of the definition for what I try to do with anything I do with art or film, and that is to pose a question that's complex and then find the simple solution that makes it the most elegant. So that's what I've learned from mathematics, and I won't forget that. So that's, whenever I do anything, that's kind of what's in the back of my mind. But people write about my films being about mathematics, and then they say 10 lakes, 13 skies. That's arithmetic, that isn't mathematics. Mathematics is much more complex and kind of beautiful and like art. It's joyful.
Hi. So, what I wanted to ask is because the way that you work with time duration and still images, they're still recorded as video. They're not images still, but like the way that one experiences your movies could be similar to the way people experience paintings in not only museums, but like I feel like with a visual artist's point of view, looking at your work, you can really see how the fact that you said that you're interested in painting and visual art is like no wonder, like, because I think that the way to experience your movies, it's the images that you put with us, even though if it has sound and movement, it is very similar to the experience of experiencing painting. It's as if you're giving us a time to experience that painting. So what I wanted to ask is, how do you feel your relationship with visual art and your taste in visual art influences in your work?
Well, now in a very practical manner, because I'm interested in not just making films, but making these kind of environments. And as my example tries to point out, it came out of something, I didn't mean that to happen, it just found itself. And so I think what still the interesting thing is when I make, like I just had a big show in my house, and I live in a small town in Valverde, near where I teach, besides being up in the mountains. And that town was also coincidentally built by black people in the 30s when they couldn't go to Palm Springs. They built their own resort town, and it was built by rather affluent blacks that were mainly jazz musicians. and a few people in Hollywood, but there weren't very many black people in Hollywood, so the money mainly came from those few entertainment areas where black people were excelling. And so they built this town, and then I made a big installation about this state of Alabama and the kind of how poor blacks and whites were played off against each other in that state. So I installed paintings, drawings, and made an environment that seemed to make sense in my house. But why am I telling you this? What was the question again? What did that?
The question I was just asking about the relationship between visual art and your work in film.
Yeah. So I'm very interested, and in this installation, on my TV set I had 5 film loops playing also that address, and then in the show it was objects and paintings, drawings, found objects, very many different kinds of artwork. But then I'm constructing it in my house as if it's almost a documentary film. You know, that even though it's got objects in that, and there's film loops, and it's an installation. I think the way I think when I put it together is the way I would think of the way I construct a film, even though it isn't a film. I mean, it's still very much influenced by the way I make films. So now I make installations with all the ideas I have in the films. I think you can see that in what I talked about today too, that it becomes a construction of that could almost be thought of as a document.
We have only time for one last question. We have like 5 minutes to leave the room.
Hello, James. I'd like to answer, how can you mix the college environment to such dark American crime history? It makes everything better to us to see, like easy American and dark, but America is dark like itself in the history. But how can you mix environment and criminal history, America?
Well, you just can do that.
And how do you study too, your study about criminal history? Like you said here, Patty Hearst, Una Bomber, again.
Yeah. Well, there's what I'm interested in is why did the SLA kidnap Patty Hearst, and what are the kind of injustices that lead sometimes to such radical mistakes, you know? Because, I mean, if the SLA kidnaps Patty Hearst, yeah, that's a bad thing, but what are they reacting against? I'm interested in that. And the same thing with Thoreau supporting John Brown. It's kind of, well, John Brown was this kind of crazy over-influenced by religion, but what he's doing still is something righteous to it, even though he's applying the wrong thing. There's this complication that I'm kind of interested in. But I don't want to think of it as being sensational, using those, because it's sensational. I'd rather get past that and kind of understand what's beneath that. Because we have these things happening. Why do they happen?
So, thank you, James, for generosity, sharing your ideas and your work with us. Thank all of you. For all the ones who are there, Festival ECRÃ continues today and tomorrow. Check out the website and Instagram page. There are plenty of interesting films. And thank you for being here. We are going downstairs and we can have more informal conversations. So have a nice Saturday, you all. Thank you. Thank you.